Hello, my friends. Today I want to share something extraordinary with you. Our friend Pedro is back, and this time he is traveling thousands of years into the past to a land of gold, secrets, and legends. Imagine joining Pedro as he meets the great Cleopatra, a queen of power, drama, and a vision that changed the world forever. So, are you ready to see ancient Egypt through his eyes? Sit back, relax, and enjoy this amazing journey. It is the perfect way to practice your English. Just read along, listen closely, and let's begin. Pedro and Cleopatra, the ancient adventure. The beginning of a great adventure. The heat of the desert was the first thing Pedro felt, a burning sun that covered everything in gold. He was sitting on a large camel, moving slowly across the endless dunes of the Sahara. The city was gone, and in its place, a world of sand and mystery appeared. Pedro looked at the horizon and saw the Great Pyramids for the very first time. They looked like massive stone mountains reaching for the deep blue sky. "This is incredible," he whispered, holding the camel's saddle as it swayed from side to side. He wasn't an ordinary traveler anymore. He was an explorer in the land of the pharaohs. In the distance, the green valley of the Nile River promised a new discovery. Pedro adjusted his clothes, feeling the warm wind on his face. A group of royal guards appeared on the path, wearing white linen and carrying bronze spears. They looked at Pedro's green t-shirt with confusion, but he simply smiled and waved his hand. "I am here to meet the queen," he said, with a brave and steady voice. The journey was just beginning, and the secrets of the past were waiting for him. The Great Palace of Cleopatra. Pedro arrived at the massive gates of Alexandria, a city of marble and light. He jumped down from his camel and stood in front of the royal palace. The entrance was a forest of tall white columns, decorated with gold and blue paintings. As he walked inside, the air became cool and smelled like exotic flowers and incense. Pedro felt like a tiny ant inside such a massive and beautiful place. He could hear the sound of water fountains and the soft whispering of the scribes. Men were sitting on the floor, writing quickly on long scrolls of papyrus. There were no cars or machines here, only the quiet rhythm of an ancient empire. Pedro walked past giant statues of gods with the heads of animals and eyes of a stone. Every room he entered was more magnificent than the last one. A royal guard led him through a private garden filled with tall palm trees. He felt nervous, but his heart was beating with pure excitement. The throne room was just ahead. Behind two golden doors that sparkled under the sun, he took a deep breath and prepared to meet the most famous queen in history. Pedro meets Cleopatra. The golden doors opened slowly, revealing a room that looked like it was made of pure light. In the center, sitting on a carved throne, was Queen Cleopatra herself. She wore a simple white dress, but her jewelry was made of gold and lapis lazuli. Pedro walked forward, feeling the heavy silence of the room. He stopped a few meters away and showed his respect with a deep bow. Cleopatra looked at him with a mix of surprise and sharp curiosity. She had never seen a person dressed in such a strange, modern way. "Who are you, traveler, and where do you come from?" she asked with a powerful voice. Pedro smiled and answered clearly, "My name is Pedro, and I come from a world you haven't seen yet." The queen was fascinated by his confidence and his mysterious stories. She stood up from her throne and walked toward him with a friendly smile. The tension in the room disappeared, and Pedro realized she was a very intelligent leader. "You are a brave man, Pedro, and I want to show you the power of my kingdom." She decided that Pedro would be her guest of honor for the day. Giza Pyramid Complex. Cleopatra led Pedro to a high balcony that overlooked the entire desert. In front of them, the pyramids of Giza stood like giants against the horizon. They were massive, perfect, and glowing under the intense afternoon sun. Pedro was speechless. He had seen photos, but the reality was much more powerful. "They are even bigger than I imagined," he thought, looking at the Great Pyramid. Cleopatra pointed toward the Great Sphinx, the silent guardian of the valley. She explained that these monuments were built to last for eternity. Pedro watched the workers in the distance, moving heavy stones with incredible precision. The scale of the construction was a mystery that defied human logic. "How did they do it?" Pedro asked, feeling a deep sense of wonder. The queen talked about the stars, the math, and the thousands of people who worked together. The pyramids were not just tombs, they were a bridge between the earth and the heavens. The dry wind blew across the balcony, carrying the dust of ancient history. Pedro felt a deep respect for the people who dreamed of such greatness. Tombs, art, and ancient objects. The queen took Pedro into a hidden chamber. Deep beneath the palace floors, the air was cool and still, and the walls were covered in vibrant, colorful paintings. Pedro saw scenes of farmers, dancers, and gods with the heads of hawks and cats. The colors were so bright that they looked like they were painted yesterday. "This is the memory of my people," Cleopatra explained, touching a cold stone wall. Pedro saw golden statues, mirrors of polished bronze, and beautiful clay jars. He was amazed by the detail in every small object, from jewelry to wooden chests. The art told stories of life, of family, and the long journey to the afterlife. There were no machines to help the artists, only their hands and their passion. Pedro realized that these treasures were more valuable than all the gold in the world. They were a way to keep the past alive, a message sent through time. He looked at a golden necklace and wondered about the person who wore it centuries ago. Every corner of the chamber was a new mystery, a new piece of a giant puzzle. It was a moment of pure art, a moment that took Pedro's breath away. Cleopatra and the hieroglyphics. The queen stopped in front of a stone wall covered in strange and beautiful symbols. She began to teach Pedro the secrets of the Medu Neter, the sacred writing. "These are not just drawings, Pedro. They are sounds, ideas, and magic." She pointed to a small bird and explained that it represented a specific letter. Pedro watched her fingers move across the carved stone with grace. He learned that a sun meant light, a lotus meant life, and an eye meant protection. It was a complex language that required patience and a sharp mind to understand. Pedro tried to read a short sentence about the rising sun and the river. He felt a strange connection to the scribes who lived thousands of years ago. The hieroglyphics were the keys to the history of the pharaohs and the gods. Cleopatra showed him how to write his own name using the ancient symbols. Pedro smiled as he saw his identity transformed into a work of art. Writing is the most powerful magic because it makes your voice eternal. Now, the walls were no longer a mystery. They were a book waiting to be read. The Queen who speaks many languages. As they walked through the palace gardens, Pedro learned something very special. Cleopatra was a master of languages. She spoke Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and many more. She was the only person in her family who decided to learn the native Egyptian tongue. To speak a person's language is to enter their heart, she said with a wise smile. Pedro realized that her power came from her ability to communicate with everyone. They talked about how words can build bridges between different worlds. Pedro felt inspired because he was also a traveler using a new language to explore. Cleopatra encouraged him to keep practicing and to never be afraid of mistakes. In a world full of borders, she showed him that being a polyglot was a superpower. It was a lesson that Pedro would never forget, a lesson about respect and curiosity. The Queen was not just a ruler, she was a scholar who loved to learn. Pedro understood that the best weapon an adventurer can have is a sharp mind. The garden was quiet, but the conversation was full of energy and life. The gods of ancient Egypt. Inside a massive temple, the atmosphere was heavy with respect and ancient power. Cleopatra introduced Pedro to the gods who guided every part of Egyptian life. She pointed to the statue of Ra, the sun god, and Anubis, the protector of the dead. Pedro looked up at the giant stone figures and felt a deep sense of peace. The Queen explained that the gods represented the forces of nature, like the river and the sky. Every animal in Egypt was a messenger of a divine spirit, a part of a bigger plan. Pedro learned about the feather of truth and how a person's heart was judged by their actions. It was a world where the physical and the spiritual lived together in harmony. The smoke from the incense rose toward the ceiling, disappearing into the shadows. Pedro understood that the Egyptians didn't just build temples, they built a way of life. The gods were not to carry, they were guardians of the order of the universe. Walking through the temple, Pedro felt the weight of thousands of years of faith. It was a spiritual journey that changed the way he looked at the world around him. Cleopatra, the stars, and ancient knowledge. Night fell over the Nile, and the sky transformed into a sea of infinite diamonds. Cleopatra led Pedro to the highest terrace, far away from the palace lights. She began to point at the constellations, explaining how the stars guided the people. We look at the sky to understand our place on earth, she whispered softly. Pedro was fascinated. He learned that the pyramids were aligned with the stars of Orion. It wasn't just luck, it was advanced science and a deep connection to the cosmos. Under the moonlight, the Queen shared secrets of math, medicine, and the cycles of time. Pedro felt a chill down his spine, realizing how much the ancients already knew. In that quiet moment, the distance between the past and the present disappeared. They were just two explorers, sharing a mystery under the same eternal stars. The stars were a map, a clock, and a source of endless inspiration for the human spirit. Pedro looked at the Milky Way and felt more connected to the universe than ever before. An adventure Pedro will never forget. The first light of morning began to paint the Nile in shades of purple and gold. Pedro knew that his time in ancient Egypt was coming to an end. He stood before Cleopatra one last time, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Take this knowledge with you, traveler," she said, handing him a small stone amulet. "As long as someone remembers our story, we will never truly die." Pedro closed his eyes, and in a second, the heat of the desert was gone. He was back in his own world, but he was not the same person anymore. He could still feel the sand on his skin and the echo of the Queen's voice in his mind. The journey was over, but the lessons would stay with him forever. History is the greatest teacher of all, Pedro thought with a proud smile. He held the amulet tight and looked at the horizon, ready for his next big adventure, because once you travel through time, the whole world becomes a book waiting to be read.